All right. We're here to talk today and hopefully for several videos moving forward about about where we are right now, both culturally and then as the church affected by the culture. I think a lot of people see, at least over the last 5 years or so, sort of a ramping up of problems, both in culture surrounding us and in the church. But a lot of people have different explanations as to what those problems are, what are causing them, how to solve them. And it's, at least for me, and in talking to Caleb as well, it caused me to just step back and say, okay, how did we get here at this place where I think a larger group of people are saying where we're at is an insane place. And so is that something that just went wrong about 5 or 6 years ago? Or as you start scratching away the surface, it's no, it's farther back than that, and not just the 1960s. And you just continue to move backwards in time, looking at various problems that lead us to where we are now. And those are some of the conversations Caleb and I have been having, and wanted to dig into those things further. So, Caleb, what are some of the things that sort of maybe got you thinking in hey, this is a bigger problem than I realized beforehand?
Yeah. Well, springing off your intro there, I think it's a great intro. I think the pandemic was a flashpoint. I use the word apocalypse, and what I mean by apocalypse is a unveiling. It's an uncovering. It's not the end of the world, right, or anything like that. It can be maybe in case of judgment, but the pandemic was a time for me where, churches were shutting down. People, preachers were coming out and saying like, "I'm sorry I ever preached that we had to be assembled," and people were saying you were unloving if you weren't vaccinated. It was crazy. It was like, really insane what was going on, and the changes in perspectives. And it was very challenging for me because among typically like non-institutional churches of Christ, I was finding there wasn't a lot of uniformity there. Now that caused me to start investigating and going back to God's word, right, and examining some of the issues. Like, whoa, how I thought everything was going good for years, right? I thought we were all unified. I thought this was going in just like a pandemic, and the wheels fall off at like everything. And so, I mean, that's like you're driving along and, your engine just shuts down. You're like, oh man, something happened. And you go to the mechanic, and the mechanic's like, no, this has been rotten for years, man. Like, you haven't done any maintenance on this. This is completely a huge problem. So I don't want to overstate the importance of the pandemic, but for me, it was kind of that point. And I had tons of time just to sit and read and sit and contemplate too, be like, okay, how did we get to this point, and what's it going to look like? Because everyone was like, oh man, we got to get back to normal. And I'm like, what is even normal? Like, is normal where we should be? Where are we going with this thing? And like, what do we need to be doing? I think that, plus also I have kids now. And as a parent, you're thinking more in future, you're thinking generationally. So those are some of the things for me that kind of, I guess, were the genesis of the investigation on it. But that was one of the things I brought up to you in some of the conversations. It's like, some people, I think, don't even think there's a problem. And so how do you talk to people about, hey guys, there's a problem? Because yeah, there's insanity, but who you talk to depends on what insanity they're talking about. And some people think the insanity is with the Republicans or Trump. Other people think it's with the Democrats, and other people are like, no, it's neither. It's something totally different. So that's kind of where there's a lot of pieces going on, a lot of problems, and totally with you about, depending on how you define the problems and the causes of those problems, you're going to come up with radically different solutions. And we need to process these things to first make sure we're properly assessing and walking circumspectly in this age before we like start tackling the solutions. Because if we slap solutions on it that actually don't address the problems, we're just going to get further problems. So I don't know if that was helpful or not, but what was your experience on it, Stephen?
Yeah. So similarly, I would say during the pandemic. It wasn't just the pandemic, but it was a lot of the chaos that really came to a boiling point, whether it's racial tensions here in the United States. And then things, brethren, to hear brethren sort of responding to that. And I thought not biblical ways. And I don't mean just terrible responses, but sort of, I think they were taking their cues from culture about how to respond to those things more than a biblical way. And so then I'm stepping back and go, wait. I know that those are things that I've heard all my life. But I didn't feel that there was a great disharmony between those maybe responses and the scriptures. But as these bowling points, I knew that these weren't good solutions, right? Those are the same things we've been saying for years, and they just don't sound right in the face of all of this. And that would be either side, right? Either people who were sort of stoking that even more, or people who were even trying to calm it down. I just felt like weren't using a biblical approach to try to answer really hard questions. And then, you talked about children. So for me, we've got, I've got my oldest daughter's married, but we've adopted a 5-year-old, and hopefully we're about to be adopting a 2-year-old fairly soon. So we've got a 19-year-old, a 21-year-old, and then a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so I'm looking at it from the perspective of, I have raised my children through I guess you would say, a fairly traditional lines, American traditional lines of thinking and so forth, with a more conservative than, maybe a conservative traditional line. And I realized some of the difficulties we had that I thought, this shouldn't be. I mean, we act like this is just normal, but it shouldn't be, right? And then all of a sudden I have this boy that comes into our lives, and I'm trying to be very intentional, because with him, it's not just we had a baby, it's we chose to step in and say, we will take this child from the danger and the harm that he is receiving in his biological family, and we'll protect him. And then I started thinking, okay, but how am I going to do that? And it made me, I think, more thoughtful about raising him than my girls. I'm not trying to say I was thoughtless, but it just made me even more thoughtful. And it made me thoughtful about, okay, what do I wish I had done that first go round? And I'm not even sure I could answer that question at that point. I knew I wanted some things to be different, but I didn't know how or what. So that made me start investigating. I don't want the same approach all across the board. There's some things I want to adjust and make different. Well, then once I started investigating that, I'm like, oh man, I think our vision of family and how we relate to each other is just so skewed, and that goes back generations. Centuries. And so there was just a real eye opener for me. And I don't know that everybody I've talked to has similar feelings, but a lot of people do. And enough do that I'm not, I know I'm not on my own here. And what was really interesting is, as I began to read, I'm like, oh, this is what people were saying, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, even a couple of 100 years ago. People were sounding alarm bells. And I've even gone back and reread books. I read a book. Charles Dickens has a book called Hard Times. And it is his most intense criticism of sort of the Industrial Revolution and the sort of factoryization of life and of people. And when I had read it, I don't know, I probably read it 10, 15 years ago, and it didn't click with me. I was like, I like Charles Dickens, but I just wasn't. This time I read it, I was like, oh man, I get it now. Yeah. He is talking about making everybody into cogs, sort of taking away the moral component of how we live our lives, or at least fracturing it, setting that, I have those moral considerations here, but business is business. And that's really the tenor of that book. And I could see how the villains were villains now. Whereas before it was like, I mean, they're just businessmen, right? It's just business.
It's just the cost of business.
Yeah, it's just the cost of business. And so, so anyway, a lot of those things really started resonating with me a lot more than they had.
Yeah, and I guess if someone's hearing you and I up to this point, they're thinking, well, Stephen and Caleb are just going through midlife crisis. They're still kind of thinking about the pandemic, or they're just kind of getting sentimental as fathers. How would you respond to somebody and say, no, like these are deeper, I don't want to overuse the word or stretch too far, like systemic or generational or continued problems, rather than just like, oh, that's just something those two are going through. Oh, you and I, we live, I'm in Puerto Rico, you're in Alabama. We don't really run around with the same social group necessarily.
Right. So, well, that's one thing I would say is just, you don't have to look far to see that a lot of people, not everybody's saying the same things are the problems or the same things are the solutions, but there's a lot of overlap between the concerns that people have. And, I think on the one hand, I'm 46 and I do feel differently than I did at 26. But I think I think sometimes what we do is, it's a whole nother issue, is that we assume that when people change their feelings when they get older, that somehow that the older feeling that they have is the problem as opposed to the younger feeling, right? Yeah. What I hope is that as I'm getting older, I see more things, right? I'm aware of more things and I'm learning more things. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have is that we are stagnant in our thinking because we don't want instability. We just want things to stay the same, just stay the same, right? So yeah, I do think there's part of that. You're getting older, you're looking around, you're like, things are not what I thought they were. Well, that should be for anybody, right? At any time, in any place, that should be a reality. But I do think there are some unique things about what's happening. And I think there are some people like, look, it's always up and down. Things get chaotic and then they settle out. And I'm trying to not approach this. Somebody said to me one time, when you have a midlife crisis, you either buy a motorcycle or you start gardening, and you've just started gardening. Like somebody said that to me. And I was like, well, at least I chose, I think, maybe the more productive of those two paths. But I think I'm trying to be more intentional than that. When we started a garden, one of the reasons we had not started a garden was some of the very things that I see as problematic now. Having a garden in this day and age is not efficient. It won't save my house money. We're spending probably as much money, at least at this point, we have spent as much money getting the garden going. We're certainly spending a ton of time on it, and things like that. And so and people have said that to me, you're not actually saving any money. And my response is, I'm not trying to save money. I'm trying to save my family.
Yeah.
And I really do mean that. I'm trying to recoup things that have been lost. I've told people, you don't have to be a farmer, but you do have to know some things farmers know. And I think biblically, from the standpoint of the way the Bible talks about farmers, you don't have to be a farmer, but you do have to know something about how a farmer thinks. I would say the same thing about athletes. You don't have to be an athlete, but you have to know something about winning and losing, about what it.
Yeah, because they're sorry to interject, but they're fundamental patterns of the world.
Yes.
Of God's system. And so to not know that, you are not only not going to be able to connect with God's word, but you're not going to be able to operate as you should in God's system if you fail to know the basic patterns of reality.
Right. Right. And so, and the Bible uses those patterns, right? It uses those patterns. And if we're too disconnected from them, then we can't even connect with what the Bible's saying. And so I think we need to reconnect and well, all of that to say, I think, to the question of, are you just having a midlife crisis? I think a midlife crisis is somebody who is being not thoughtful, right? They're looking for some kind of purpose. And usually it's a very frivolous sort of pursuit to satisfy something, right? What have I done with my life? And looking for some kind of excitement. It's really not that. If it was that, I would have stopped all of this a while back, because I mean, it's not exciting in that sense. So I hope it's a more thoughtful and more biblically connected approach. And that's what I would say to people, is that I am trying to connect more with what God has said in his word. And most of all, I would say the biggest thing of all for me that I've learned is that my life should be more completely and totally connected to God and his word in every aspect.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest eye opener for me. A while back, I preached a lesson on Leviticus, and the way we look at Leviticus is these are a lot of weird rules that I'm glad I don't have to follow. But if you look at it, there was not a moment of an Israelite's day that God had not said something about. God told them, he talked to them in specific terms about what clothes to wear, what to eat, what not to eat. He had instructed them about how to deal with going to the restroom, to the bathroom, right? Well, not a bathroom, but relieving themselves. Here's what you do with that. He gave them very detailed instructions that seem so peculiar. One of the things I brought up is that the command not to boil a goat in its mother's milk. It's odd that he not only gives that command early on, right after the 10 Commandments, but he as he's reinstituting the covenant at Mount Sinai, he repeats this: don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. Well, if you and I were just looking at the rules, we would think that's not, whatever that is, it's probably not that important. It's important enough that it sits there at the reinstitution of the covenant after they've broken it, after he's telling them. So whatever that means, it's of pretty vital importance. And so I realized that here are the Israelites. They can't go through a moment of their day without thinking, if they're doing it right, without thinking about what God has said about what they're doing. But we live most of our lives thinking, I think it's a problem a lot of people fall into, a lot of our brethren fall into, which is God has said very specific things about how we worship him, and the rest is kind of indifferent.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's true. I don't think that's ever been true, and I think it's still not true. I think God cares about everything we do throughout the day.
Amen. Yeah, there's definitely a fragmentation that has happened, and hopefully, Lord willing, we'll have more time to break down fragmentation, what we're trying to say by that. But a separation between the secular religious split is a major issue, and that's one when you're bringing up about kind of the integration of God into the lives of the Israelites. It's the same with us. We shouldn't have this breaking and this separation. And one thing during the pandemic that I started to see, and you mentioned there were racial tensions as well in there. Thankfully here in Puerto Rico, we didn't have much of the racial thing going on as did the States, but the pandemic issue was a lot bigger. But as you started seeing this and the rise of transgenderism, and now more of the rise of what some call the authoritarian right, etc. There's all these things going on, and it's like, what these problems in of themselves have values. Like each decision and each inflection point is a battle of a value hierarchy. and decisions that we even make, as you're pointing out, choosing not to boil a mother goat with its kid is the embodiment or the inculcation of values and patterns of being. And I know this might sound really heady and stuff like that, but when I started thinking about like, wait a second, my decisions are based upon values. It was one of these things as a Christian, is like, yeah, I know my values come from God. They come from Jesus. I read the Sermon on the Mount, have all these values, but the values were kind of like very rationalistic, like, faith, hope, love, all this kind of stuff. But then they lacked embodiment. They lacked, and I wouldn't say like full application, but there was a lot of times where certain actions weren't, as you pointed out earlier, the most thoughtful, or I didn't take it and say, hey, this has got to be fully consistent, or it's got to be holistically embodying or fully consistent with the value that I'm professing. I kind of held these things, these contradictory things, and I was very split and scattered, and it didn't really start coming out to me. It's like, whoa, there's got to be a better way to that, until you recognize like, oh, things start breaking down. And I totally agree with you on the idea that this is not just a midlife crisis, because you nor I are saying, oh, we want to go back to our 20s. Oh, we want to recapture the glory days. Like, we don't believe in the glory days here,
Right.
or the golden age, that type of thing. That's not what we're trying to recapture. It goes back.
I'm embarrassed by those days. I don't want to go back there.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I would be embarrassed by that is because I look at my kind of fragmented, torn way of thinking and way of living, and just be like, well, that's I wouldn't want that to be a model for anybody. I don't even look at that as a model. And so I think that is very important for people to understand, is that maybe some modern critics would be like, oh, well, they're just wanting to return to, the 1960s or the 1860s or fill in the blank, or 1760s. But that's not the case at all. And I think there's also an aspect here that I want to throw in with the pandemic. You mentioned the industrialization with Charles Dickens. I think that's really great. I think that's an underappreciated and understudied area of history, because with the rise of Romanticism in that movement and the Transcendentalists pushing back against the mechanization and materialistic view of humanity, we don't really pay attention to that. But the information revolution with the internet is like the industrial revolution on steroids, like a million times over. And we have not done a very good job as brethren of considering the implications of that. I know you Stephen, have got a great series on the internet, actually recorded, that on technology. Is very good, very helpful. But I just have thought about this in talking with young people today, and the changes in dating, the changes in relationship, the changes in human communication. The pandemic has changed that. Technology has changed that. Cultural values have changed that. So much is changing, and there's very little that I look around and I'm like, yes, in these changings, we are becoming closer to the embodiment of Christ in our lives and in our communities. And there doesn't seem to be any brakes on it. I mean, the car is like no brakes, going full down the mountain, headed to the boulders. And we see this worse and worse. And there's not much cohesion in terms of, maybe there's cohesion, as you're saying. I agree. Like the zeitgeist, most people think, yeah, there's problems, but they maybe haven't thought about it deep enough to be like, these are the problems. And because they don't identify the problems or the causes of the problems, they don't have any solution to stopping the train wreck that we're facing and that is ahead of us. I really believe that, especially, I'm just going to use one example: pornography, the breakdown of marriage rates in our country, the lack of children. I mean, the list can go on, but I don't hear our brethren speaking about these issues with existential significance, if that makes sense. And that's where I'm trying to say, okay, I'm not just trying to be an alarmist over here. I'm not trying to be a golden age boy to go back to the glory days. There's a significant problem here. We need to address it and we need to talk about it, but we got to be able to actually have conversations. And that brings another whole issue of, we don't even really know how to talk to each other anymore. And so I'm sorry, I know that's a lot to throw out there. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of these, because of you say the information age. One of the things about the information age is the rapid movement. Now, I think in a lot of ways, we think we're growing technologically faster than we actually are. I don't think that's moving as rapidly as people think. We're speeding up.
You mean the progression? Just to clarify, you're talking about the progression of technological advancement. Information moves rapidly, but
Yes.
the advance of new technologies is not going that fast.
Right. I'm trying to think of a book. Well, I can think of it later.
Neil Postman comes to mind, but
now Neil Postman. I mean, you're talking. I mean, he was saying this with the TV, right? I mean, he's saying this long before we got to where we are now. And people just sort of shrug their shoulders. He's a curmudgeon, he's an old guy, a Luddite. And I would have felt that way. And now I read him and I'm just like, ooh, if that was true then, man, it makes you sick to think how much truer it is now. And you mentioned the series I did on the internet. I feel like I didn't go far enough. I mean, I really think that people don't, it's hard because the changes have happened rapidly within one generation, right? I mean, so for instance, for my generation, we did not have internet when I was growing up. And so I'm not, I mean, I know I'm 46, but I'm not that old. And I remember not having the internet to having the internet. But still it was very slow, dial-up speeds, all that kind of stuff. All the way to now, where you just have constant stream of information available to you at all times. And yes, you have valuable information accessible, but can we all agree that's not what we're accessing? As a culture, we're not going for the valuable, the true, the good, and the lovely. We are pursuing the lowest common denominator. And I don't even mean pornography, which we are doing that as a culture, but I just mean things that are just vapid. They're so empty, and they make us empty, right? We are what we consume. And if what we're consuming, I think this goes back into the indifference, right? What does it matter if your kids are watching something if it's not specifically immoral, right? If it's not grossly immoral, it may be stupid and silly and so forth. And I'm not saying that we can't have silly things, but when your kids are drinking in silliness and emptiness every day, you're making your children silly and empty people. And so that's the sort of thing where people will look at questions like the internet and they'll, instead of saying, is this helpful and is this good and is this bringing me closer to God, they will simply say, is it specifically condemned, right? Is this a thing that is specifically sinful? And I think the question that needs to be asked is, what is it on a bigger scale? What is this doing to me? Is it making me wiser?
The influence, the conditioning, the subtle things that we just take for granted every day. Yeah. And it becomes a form of twisting the mind too. I knew a young lady, a Christian, she decided to get off Facebook, and the number of Christians that berated her and said, you will not be able to evangelize as you should as a Christian without Facebook. I'm like, guys, where have we gotten to? So there's a ubiquity about the internet that is definitely very challenging. The idea of neutrality as well. That's something I've challenged a lot with these technological things. Those are things I'd love to get into in further like future conversations, Lord willing, with you, Stephen. And I think part of the challenge is if you're just thinking with a very materialistic or secularistic mindset, you can't really even admit these are problems. Like you'll maybe admit some of the symptoms are problematic, but it's like, someone who has cancer and they don't have, they lack energy, right? And it's like, well, you just need to take some more energy drinks and that'll solve your problem. And it's like, no, like no matter of like Red Bull energy drink is going to take away your cancer. You've got to solve the root problem. And it's a situation where I think we're in a really difficult spot because the analysis of the problem is going to require a mindset that we are conditioned in the problem not to be able to see, almost. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would even adjust that illustration a little bit. I think it's like somebody with type 2 diabetes. They've just been diagnosed and they're thinking, if I could just get back to pre-diabetes, right? If I could just get back to where I wasn't just feeling miserable, I was doing okay and eating all the Twinkies I wanted and so forth. If I could just stay right there. And of course, you can't stay right there. You were always heading in this direction. And that's one of the things you and I have talked about, is that I think people look at where we are and they go, okay, if we could just get back. This is certainly where your secular modernists are. People like Jonathan Haidt, who I know a lot of people have read Anxious Generation, which I think there's some very helpful things there. But Jonathan Haidt wants to get back to the 90s.
Yeah.
And he thinks like the 90s is peak civilization.
Hey, so does the Matrix.
Yeah, sure. Right. So we could just, if we could just get back, and I think, it's not just him, but, what's the guy that wrote The End of History? I can't even remember his name right now, but the guy wrote a book called The End of History, and basically was saying, we're done. We've reached the point where there won't be any more major conflicts. And, we've reached this place where we figured it out. And I think, as you said, 2020 should have been a revealing that all of that was bunk. None of that was true. That we have not reached. We had a thin veneer, and we were ignoring everything underneath. And then it got exposed, and there are people that are just working as hard as they can to say, how can we get the veneer back on and just keep coasting right there?
Oh man, that opens up a ton of things. And going back to your illustration about the type 2 diabetic to pre-diabetes, it's like, that's exactly what I heard when I heard so many people, Christians. I'm not talking about worldly people, I'm talking about our brethren in non-institutional churches of Christ. They would say, I just want to get back to normal. And I'm like, guys, that normality, whatever that is, got us to this place. And if you were to run, and you and I have talked about this before, if you run the experiment, whatever we were doing, and you input that program, the pandemic is going to happen the way it happened 100 times out of 100. Congregations are going to break down, all this kind of stuff. In a larger scale, the same thing with transgenderism, the same thing with whatever's going to happen. And I wonder, I know this is speculation, but the unveiling of the pandemic, in my opinion, is kind of like small pebbles compared to the train wreck that could be. Who knows, right? But one of the macro, messages of the Bible is that God brings judgment, and you can prolong judgment a bit, but if you refuse his truth, if you go against the fundamental patterns of what he has created, it's a question of when, not if. And so this is one of the things that's like, okay, guys, pandemic bad, right? We're all on the board. Okay, things that have happened bad. Okay, what have we done to change it? Like, what are we doing to actually fundamentally change our trajectory? And sadly, when I ask elders or Christians in the United States or even other places about that, I just get crickets. And I'm like, that is even bigger problem. Using your diabetic situation, it's like, okay, you've got diabetes type 2. What are you going to do to manage this in your life? And it's just like, I'm just going to keep eating Twinkies. It's like, no.
Just take the insulin and keep going. Well, our time is coming to. I'll leave you with this. We studying Genesis here in our young adult class, and we were working through the flood, And as you come out of the flood narrative, you come out of chapter 8 and chapter 9, you see a recreation, right? You see a hearkening back, right? The land rising up from the water. You see the seasons being put back in their place, and so forth. And you see a reconnection with Noah to God as Noah offers sacrifice and God finds it a pleasing aroma. Then what you have is Noah growing a vineyard, taking of the fruit and sinning, and becoming drunk. Then his son, one of his three sons, um, uh, then participating or even exacerbating that sin and taking it one step further. And so you have division between his sons and a curse that comes because of the sin. And I think one of the things that you can learn from that, as you connect that back with Genesis chapter 3, is a lot of people think if we could just have a reset, if we could just start over, whatever point, if we could go back to here. I think one of the lessons you learn in Genesis chapter 9 is we're always going to end up back here. Unless we make our solution tied, and I mean really tied to God and his ways, we will always end up right back here. I can just imagine Israel, throughout their history, during times of oppression, when they were suffering, if we could just get back to whatever the good old days were in their minds.
Solomon days, yeah.
Or even Jeroboam, Jeroboam the second, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jeroboam the second was a high point. And can't you just imagine, during the divided kingdom, Israel in the north going, boy, the times were good during Jeroboam the second. No, those times were leading you to right now. And they were always going to lead you to right now. Or maybe Jehu, maybe somebody would look back and say, when we finally got Ahab out of there and we got Jehu in place, then things, no, you were always going to end up here because that was not enough. That was treating the symptoms and not the heart of the issue.
Right. And when you say they're always going to end up there, it's not because God had predestined them to that punishment. Rather, it was the values, the choices and the values that they were embodying in their decisions, their life, their culture, everything was fundamentally rejecting God and putting them on that trajectory. Yes. So they had time to maybe like restore or renovate or go back and do resets. It's not that, if I'm hearing you right, you're not saying a reset is not possible. It is possible, but Band-Aid solutions or partial solutions on this are going to create the same trajectory.
Right. Well, one of the things I've started saying a lot is we think that the solutions, and especially as a culture, we think the solutions are right around the corner. We're going to learn more. We're going to figure things out, and right around the corner, we'll figure out how to deal with this. And the solutions are always in the other direction. They're always in the past.
That's good.
And specifically in the person of Jesus Christ, that's where the solution is, right? So the only reset that works, and we're going to talk about restoration, I know, as we go along here, is real, actual, full restoration. And I think this is not a knock against the work that people have done to restore elements of New Testament Christianity. I'm on board with that project. I just think we got to keep going. That's what Marshall preached here at Pepper Road yesterday, was about the philosophy of restoration. And one of his points about why we need this philosophy is because the work's not done, and it never will be. Right? We always have to be looking and saying, where else do we need to restore? And I think for some people, the project, that mindset stops at a certain point and says, okay, we're there. As soon as you think that, then you're right back on the trajectory to end up, in a place like this.
Amen. So, well, I think that's a great place to stop if that's good for you. But I'm looking forward to these conversations and looking forward to getting into details. Hopefully no one leaves us thinking, oh, well, this is just Stephen Caleb hour of complaining. We're hopefully going to break these things down more. We want to get into the specifics of why these things are problematic, the causes behind them, and then, as Stephen said, offer the ancient solutions that God has proposed to hopefully have that proper change and get off a destructive trajectory. So
yeah, absolutely. All right, Caleb, good to talk to you. Look forward
Thanks,
to next time.
All right. God bless.